If you asked an economist from the 1950s, 60s, 70s to explain the resource known as data, they would have looked at you as if you had never been taught the first thing about economics. The traditional approach to defining resources involves identifying the property resources of land and capital and examining the labor resources of the human resources of labor and the entrepreneur. The four traditional economic resources of land, capital, labor, and the entrepreneur now have a new partner. That partner is data. This economic resource is unlike any of the other resources, and the purpose of this presentation is to examine how the modern economy is being transformed by this new resource data, and to examine the specifics of the transformation and how it is affecting competition and therefore market efficiency. First, the numbers. There's a whole lot of data going on. This chart was borrowed from The Economist, and it demonstrates to us, displays to us the annual percentage increase, average annual increase for each segment of the globe. So, for instance, annually between 2010 and 2018, China has increased its data production by 42%. Asia Pacific, a little over 36%. EMEA, which is Europe, Middle East, Asia, over 35%. In the United States, about 32% annual increase. The rest of the world, about 37% annual increase in data creation. So, down bottom, in zettabytes. So what is a zettabyte? All right, let's try to put this in numbers we can sort of kind of almost wrap our brains around. 19 trillion DVDs is a zettabyte, and it's estimated that the world will create 90 trillion zettabytes this year, which is just staggering, right? So it shows you the creation of zettabytes between 2010 and 2020, right? And if you wanted to get really technical, zettabyte is a measure of storage capacity is 2 to the 70th power. It's 10 to the 21st. It's just a 1 with a whole bunch of zeros after it. So you understand now that there's a lot of data to be crunched out there by businesses, people, and governments. Although it is difficult to wrap our brains around the idea of a zettabyte, now we have some semblance of what's going on in the world of this new resource. This absolutely crazy exponential growth in the existence of data, and therefore the value of data. If we look at the second bullet point here, this is just the United States, just the U.S. estimated value of the new resource between 1.5 and $2 trillion. That's how much the data is worth, and that's an estimate. We'll talk later about the difficulties of estimating the value of data, but it's the most accurate estimate to date. So, in terms of another number, we can compare the, let's say, $2 trillion worth of data value. It's roughly 5% of the nation's stock of capital. Now, what does this mean? So if we went out and took a measure, a dollar value of all the machines, equipment, plants, property, factories, software, logistic systems in the United States, it would add up to roughly somewhere in the neighborhood of 45 trillion, about, right? So the estimate is that the data as a resource is worth roughly 5% of the nation's stock of capital, right? So the nation's stock of capital is worth roughly 50 trillion, 45 trillion. The data is worth about 5% of that. So as you can imagine, when you have an economic resource that's grown this quickly, this fast, the exponential growth of its existence, and the importance of its value, it's transforming all economic activity. We will investigate in much more detail how and why this new resource is transforming economic activity. Like any other economic issue, the existence of and the growth of, in both real terms and value, data creates both economic tensions and economic trade offs. Much more will be spoken about this particular bullet point later in the presentation. Economics is the social science concerned with the maximizing society's happiness given the fact that we live with the burden of scarcity. Limited economic resources, unlimited economic desires and wants. Economic growth is one of the principal goals of any nation. Sometimes new processes and developments affect economic efficiency and therefore economic growth. The standard of living or the health and well-being of every person is determined by how efficiently society uses its limited or scarce resources. The remainder of this presentation will investigate the theory of economic efficiency through the presentation of pure competition versus monopoly and traditional ideas associated with economic efficiency, and more specifically investigate how the introduction of data as the new economic resource could be altering economic growth and therefore economic efficiency. Before we examine the specific effects of data as the new resource in the economy, it's important to review the principles of competition and economic efficiency. What are we looking at on this particular slide? On the left-hand side, you have your typical market denoted by a large number of buyers and a large number of sellers. First, look at the downward sloping pinkish fuchsia demand curve, the reddish curve, literally hundreds of thousands of buyers. The upward sloping green market supply curve, thousands of sellers, thousands of sellers. What is the market for? This is the market for wheat. On the vertical axis, you measure price. On the horizontal axis, you measure quantity. The market forces of supply and demand determine the outcome in the market, equilibrium, price, and quantity. Buyers are acting in their own self-interest to maximize utility. Suppliers, producers are acting in their own self-interest to maximize profit. As if led by an invisible hand, the market comes to rest at a temporary meeting of supply and demand called equilibrium, and price is determined by the market forces, sometimes called the rational function of prices. So, the left-hand side is the market. What is this the market for? Again, it's an agricultural product, wheat, which is a homogeneous or standardized product, and it's a good representation of pure competition. No one seller has much influence on the market, and thousands of buyers acting independently don't have any influence on the equilibrium price or quantity. If this is the case, where there are literally thousands of producers, in this case farmers of this agricultural product wheat, what is demand for this single farmer? Well, it turns out that the single farmer becomes a price taker at the price determined by the markets. So again, left-hand side, your typical market situation. Right-hand side, how does the individual farmer experience demand for the product he is selling? Economists call this example on the right here a perfectly elastic, E-L-A-S-T-I-C, elastic demand curve. In other words, the producer, the single farmer, the one among the many, is a price taker at the market price. It's important to remember this idea of each producer competing in a purely competitive market as a price taker. That is to say that the farmer, the producer, the single firm among the many in the agricultural market has no control over price, is a price taker. Economists believe this leads to productive and allocative efficiency when the market, the left-hand side, hundreds or thousands of buyers, hundreds or thousands of sellers, determine equilibrium, and each producer is a price taker. More about efficiency soon. Okay. what happens in the long run in a purely competitive market? Let's look first on the left-hand side at the graph representing the single firm. We can assume this is a similar situation to the previous graph where there are a large number of firms and each firm is a price taker. Each firm is producing a standardized product. This could represent the oil market in the United States, where there are literally thousands of independent drillers because of fracking and directional drilling. If you look at the horizontal MR, marginal revenue curve, that is the same exact idea as the perfectly elastic demand curve from the previous slide. The single firm is a price taker at the market price. The market price was determined by the right-hand graph, the industry, a very large number of buyers and a very large number of sellers in the oil industry. So on the right-hand side, market price was determined as $50 per barrel. Here's the beauty of pure competition. If we look at the cost structure of a firm competing in a purely competitive market situation in the long run, we have this triple connection of price equal marginal revenue, price equals minimum average total cost, and price equals marginal cost. Economists believe this creates the most efficient outcome and therefore the best allocation of society's resources. Now, economists realize prices will change based on market forces. So let's assume for a moment that there was an increase in demand because this particular product, in this case oil, became far more popular or more necessary for economic activities. Notice that the market price is driven up by the market forces of buyers wanting more of this particular commodity. Could be an increase in the number of buyers, could be an increase in taste and preference. But the market will have this dynamic adjustment if higher prices persist, such that firms making an economic profit where price is above minimum average total cost, it will draw new competitors into the market, right? Firms will realize, hey, we can make economic profit and the supply will increase. But notice, as the supply increases, price falls back down to the original level. This efficiency is only possible if firms can enter and exit the market without any barriers or obstacles. Later on in this video, we will discuss and debate and explain how and why large, powerful firms who control data are preventing new firms from entering the market and therefore not allowing for this dynamic adjustment to increase the efficiency in the market and create the most efficient outcome for all parties under consideration. Now that we have a firm grip of how a purely competitive market operates, let's discuss the importance of economic efficiency as identified by economists in purely competitive markets. This will be our paradigm or model to address the concerns raised by those who believe large companies are using data to create monopolies and therefore disrupt the effectiveness of the purely competitive nature of markets and the dynamic adjustment which should happen to create economic efficiency. First, a definition. Productive efficiency. Produce a good or service at the lowest possible cost, which means use the least amount of resources necessary to produce a good or service. So, productive efficiency, price equals minimum average total cost. Let's think about what this means in relation to a purely competitive market and why each firm continually updates its approach to controlling costs in order to maximize its profits in the long run. So, go back to the example of either the single fracker or directional driller in the oil market or one farmer in the wheat market. If you are a price taker, you're one firm among the many, and you have absolutely positively no control over the price of the good that you sell. The only thing you can control is your level of output, and look for ways to improve your efficiency by adopting the newest, best, most technological advanced methodology of production. That is to say, produce the good using the least cost method of production. So, in a purely competitive market, we believe price equals minimum average total cost and therefore creates allocative efficiency. We will see this on the graph momentarily. Notice that a single firm on the left-hand side is a price taker, right? Price on the vertical axis, capital P, is determined by the market on the right-hand side, right? Price equals marginal revenue. Well, now what does that mean? It means that this firm can sell as many units as they wish, but the additional revenue they receive from selling the next unit of output, the marginal revenue, will always equal the price because the firm is a price taker and demand for the single firm is perfectly elastic at the market price. So in the long run, what happens is because of dynamic adjustment, which we just witnessed on the previous slide, right? Price equals minimum average total cost. In other words, firms are making enough revenue to cover their explicit costs, the obvious costs, and the implicit costs, the cost to acquire and keep the owner's resources, but there are no economic profits to be had. If economic profits are present, more firms will enter the industry. Of course, if economic losses persist, firms would exit the industry. So, in a purely competitive market situation, in the long run, price equals minimum average total cost. Each firm is producing the next unit of output at the lowest possible average total cost per unit, and that creates productive efficiency. Allocative efficiency. Price equals marginal cost. Let's look at the marginal cost curve, right? First, a review. What is allocative efficiency? Allocative efficiency is the proper combination or the correct mix of output that maximizes society's happiness or satisfaction. In other words, how many TV sets, how many visits to the doctors, how many repairs to your automobile, right? How many air conditioning sets, how many grapes, how many trips to Disney World, right? So the combination, the mix of output that maximizes society's happiness. If market forces determine the use of resources, economists believe the economy will achieve allocative efficiency. Now, why and how does this happen in a purely competitive market? Well, each firm will produce the level of output where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Think of it in these terms. We looked at the oil producer. The marginal revenue of selling the next barrel of oil is $50 because that was the price in the markets. The firm will be happy to produce and sell that next unit of output as long as the marginal revenue, $50, is greater than or equal to the cost associated with producing that next unit of output. The marginal cost, the change in cost the firm undergoes or receives from producing the next unit of output. The firm will stop producing any level of output beyond the point where marginal revenue is greater than marginal cost. So, think of it in these terms. Marginal cost is use of resources, additional land, capital, labor needed to produce that next unit of output. By default, a purely competitive market will stop producing a product where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Why is this beneficial to society? Well, it maximizes the efficiency of use of resources because only the land, capital, labor, and entrepreneur ability necessary to produce where MR equals MC will be dedicated to the production of this particular good. In this case, oil, or in the case of the agricultural product, wheat. Now, why is this important? All right. In the long run, if we look on the right-hand side, we maximize that lime green triangle, which is called consumer surplus, and that strange looking triangle-ish orange area, which is called producer surplus. In other words, a purely competitive market creates the most efficient outcome for society because we achieve both productive and allocative efficiency. We maximize consumer and producer surplus. Now, we could spend a great deal of time on consumer and producer surplus, but to save time for this presentation, we'll comment on it quickly. If you look at price in the market, $50, and you look at the segment of the demand curve where the green downward sloping demand curve, the point, that white point on the demand curve, all sellers pay that price. But if you look at the section or segment of the demand curve between the white point at price 50 and going upward towards the vertical axis, that represents all the buyers who were willing and able to purchase this product at a price above 50 or above the market price. But none of those buyers had to pay above the market price. They all paid $50. If we complete the triangle, right, P over to the white dot all the way up the demand curve and back down the vertical axis, economists believe this maximizes the efficiency of what we call consumer surplus. Likewise, if we look at the red upward sloping supply curve and we look at the point on the supply curve, again the same white point, and we look at price in the market, $50, then we look at the segment of the supply curve below the price that makes the orangish triangle. That represents all the sellers who were willing and able to sell this product at a price below $50, but they didn't have to accept anything lower than $50. They all sold at the market price. Economists believe that only in a purely competitive market situation do we maximize producer and consumer surplus and achieve productive and allocative efficiency. These are important ideas to remember when we consider the new resource of data and how it disrupts economic efficiency. It is everywhere. But what is it? This stuff we call data. One of the issues with data, whether it's referred to as a good or a resource, most of this presentation will concentrate on its applications as a resource, is defining what type of good or resource data actually is. So a bit of economic background is going to be extremely helpful in explaining the dilemma here when we'll say defining, explaining, or analyzing the use of data. So two definitions here: rival or rivalrous behavior and excludable or excludability. So let's talk about the idea of rival. If a good is rival or a resource is rival, it means that if I'm consuming it, you can't be simultaneously consuming it. So if I were a business and I owned, let's say, bauxite that was necessary to make aluminum, if I have the bauxite, you can't simultaneously use it. All right, from the standpoint of, say, a consumer good, something like pizza, right? If I have a slice of pizza, it's in my lap or it's in my hands, I'm eating it. There's no way for you to simultaneously consume that pizza and receive the utility, right? So those are good examples of rivalrous, right? As opposed to something that's non-rival, something like, say, sunlight, right? If I'm, say, enjoying the sunlight, you could be enjoying that very same sunlight, right? Something like the military, right? If the military is protecting me, it could also be protecting you. So there's no way, that we can't be simultaneously receiving the utility. So unrelated to rival is the idea of excludability. Excludability has to be with the idea of, all right, if I paid for it, I receive the benefit, as opposed to non-excludable where even if me or someone else pays for it, someone else could also be receiving that benefit from that good, right? So for instance, when you think about something like fireworks, right? If I were to pay for fireworks, light them off in my backyard, obviously I'm going to receive the benefit from that particular event, but there's no way to exclude me from. for you from enjoying the fireworks once they're lit off. If you're my neighbor, you live right down the street. All right, so they're non-excludable. So now let's talk about the idea of private goods, artificially scarce, common goods, and public goods. Most of the time when you talk about economics, you talk about the market for private goods, which is goods that are both rival and excludable, right? As you draw your typical supply and demand curves, and this, again, the example of pizza, right? If I pay for a pizza, you can't have it, so it's rivalrous, and you can't be simultaneously consuming it. And if you don't pay for it, you don't get any, so it's also excludable. This applies to most of our idea of goods in the economy. They're private goods. What about an example of rival but non-excludable? We call that a common resource. Okay, so let's think of an example of something we would say such as the public library, and not the public library in our town. So let's say it's the public library. I'm in Pennsylvania. Let's say it's in, I don't know, it's in Idaho, right? So it's in Boise, Idaho. I don't pay taxes in Boise, Idaho, so I can stroll into the library and sit down at a table and start using that particular service, right? But in a way, it's rivalrous because if me and my friends sit down at a table, I'm eventually going to run out of room in that library. So we call this a common resource, right? A common resource. So it's not excludable because I can use it even if I didn't pay for it. But there's a rivalrous aspect to it because at some point the library would get crowded, right? Now what about artificially scarce? So it's excludable in that we can prevent people who didn't pay for it from using it, but it's non-rivalrous, meaning that if I'm using it, you could be using it at the same time. An example of this would be something like Netflix, okay? I pay my $7.99 a month, and I can watch a popular show, assuming that I'll just pick a show on Netflix. Orange is the New Black. Let's assume I'm watching that. There's no way to prevent you from watching it at the same time. So it's excludable in that if you didn't pay for the service, you don't get to use it. But it's non-rivalrous, right? It's non-rivalrous in that, two of us can be consuming it at the same time. Now, I know someone's thinking in the back of your mind, you could steal someone's password, and therefore, it doesn't really fit in the idea of excludability. But let's assume that we're obeying the rules or the laws. So it's a good example of what we call artificially scarce. Then we have finally the rare case of non-rivalrous and non-excludable. We call these public goods. Now, the military would be something like a public good, right? I pay taxes and the military protects me. You refuse to pay taxes and the military still protects you. So it's non-rivalrous in that you don't have to pay for it to receive the benefit, and it's not excludable because we can't exclude anyone from receiving the benefit, right? So the question is, where does data fit into this scheme, okay? And we'll talk about this idea of what's called the free rider problem. You think about the idea of a public good, right? Why the government has to provide these. So think about the interstate highway system, right? No private market would on its own spontaneously produce the interstate highway system because the cost is enormous, but since it's non-rivalrous, there's no way to charge anyone for it, right? So the real question is, where does data fit into this particular scheme, and what are the economic consequences of labeling data, and should we change the rules about data so that we want it to fit into one of these four boxes? But what exactly is data? Perhaps there are three different interpretations to this question. Data as a natural resource and therefore a private good. Data as more of a public good, typical to sunlight. Or data something in between, such as a club good. Let's talk about data as a private good, the oil metaphor. Data as a natural resource. Why is data sometimes considered like oil a natural resource? Well, it can be owned and it can be traded. So if you think about our understanding of a private good is rivalrous, right, and excludable. So in many ways it can be owned and it can be traded. Some economists and business individuals view data as the fuel of the future. They compare data to the oil metaphor, saying it's an easy metaphor. Much like oil, it must be refined to be useful. If you think about extracting oil from the ground through the drilling process and then refining it into something such as jet fuel, gasoline, or kerosene, in many ways, data is similar to oil. And think about the example of driver or self-driving cars, right? Somehow, companies such as Google and many other companies, they collect lots and lots of data through experiments on self-driving cars. But this data needs to be analyzed. Right? Literally thousands of low-level workers are paid to analyze this data. So it's gathered and then it's analyzed. So data used in this capacity, it resembles a basic economic input similar to land when we analyze something like a manufacturing firm. Advertising data resembles the oil metaphor as well. This type of data, it's tradable, and in many ways it's more easily assigned a value. However, the oil metaphor and the idea of data as a private good and a natural resource, this interpretation at some point breaks down. Data has failed to become a new asset class. Most data never changes hands, and it has been difficult to make data tradable, right? Unlike self-driving cars and advertising data, most corporations collect data in different ways, and it's difficult to value data in a trade. In other words, data gathered by one corporation has a tremendous amount of use, but in the hands of someone else, it's basically useless, right? So the value of data in many ways is determined by who controls it, right? For some, it's digital dust. For others, it's digital gold, right? If you think about what if FedEx gathers data on the algorithms associated with delivering their packages. All right, that's all fine, well and good, but that will do nothing for a company in, say, a retail situation or industry. So it's also defining property rights or ownership of data is equally tricky, right? So when you think about data collected by something as dating sites or dating apps, for instance, an individual goes onto a dating site. They offer lots of information about themselves. They interact with other people. But the real question is then who owns this data? Right? Is the data owned by the individual? Is it owned by the two people who interact? Or is it owned by the company who made the platform available in the first place? Let's investigate the second possible approach to making sense of data. Data as a public good. Data as sunlight, the idea of infrastructure. In this version, we treat data as a public good to be used to maximize the wealth creation of the entire economy or nation. The idea is to use it to maximize wealth creation for the entire well-being of all citizens within a country. This approach would interpret data similar to infrastructure. So if you think about infrastructure in the economy, roads, bridges, highways, railways, in this version, data becomes the digital twin of physical infrastructure. If you think about the idea of a public good, which we defined earlier, a public good is produced by the government or provided by the government because the market would never provide this particular good or service. The interstate highway system is a tremendous example. Think about all of the economic activity that is made available to the country because of the existence of the interstate highway system. Perhaps we could treat data in this same manner as the digital version of infrastructure. But data as sunlight begs the question, should data be tradable at all? Instead of a tradable good, data should be used as much as possible to maximize social wealth. So a different interpretation than data as a natural resource. There is a term called open data movement. And this idea suggests that data needs to be shared for the common good and be accessible to all. However, if we were to follow this path, we would need to establish clearly new institutions to balance access and use of data, right? And that would require significant public investment, similar to the public investment for physical infrastructure. There are definite limitations to this approach. The largest limitation to treating data as a common good, a public good, digital infrastructure, comes from the idea of privacy issues. And these privacy issues apply both to individuals and to companies. The government could attempt to limit the issues surrounding privacy by enforcing stricter privacy laws. Recently, the European Union and California have instituted such laws with limited success. Now, companies, they employ a strategic economic approach to disseminating data. Companies weigh the marginal benefits and marginal costs associated with acquiring and using data. So attempting to separate harmless from harmful data could prove extremely tricky. So wrapping it up here, the idea is data is similar to sunlight. It exists everywhere. It is underlying everything, and therefore it should be shared by everyone. Let's now revisit our chart and describe or explain where data fits in on this chart. All right, quick reminder. Rival means I have it, you can't have it. Excludable means you don't pay for it, you can't have it. All right? So those are the brief descriptions of our little chart up here, our little box. So where does data fit in? All right? Well, first, data is non-rivalrous. Why? Well, they are infinitely copyable, right? They can be used by many people without limiting the use by others. So data is non-rival, right? So talk about non-rivalrous. So down bottom on the left, you see non-rivalrous, right? But they're also excludable. Well, how are they excludable, right? Technologies like encryption can control who has access to data. But the real trick here is that it depends on where you set the cryptography slider. Like data can indeed be a private good like oil or a public good like sunshine. So as it doesn't fit perfectly into any one of these four boxes, depending on how much we exclude access based on cryptology. Therefore, we're going to visit quickly on the next slide the last interpretation of data. Technological advancements are opening up the possibility of treating data as a club good. The third interpretation of how to make sense of data. Now, how does this interpretation of data work? Think of a group of scientists who are all interested in the same area of study, like theoretical physics. You have particle accelerators in a few places in the world. They're extremely expensive to build. One is in CERN, C-E-R-N, in Switzerland, a particle accelerator. Right, the European Particle Accelerator is a particle accelerator here in the United States. Well, under this type of arrangement, the data generated in the experiments would be accessible to the members of a club, right? And therefore, it would facilitate theoretical physics to share information and develop new theories on scientific approach to understanding the universe, right? How about something like the environment? If you think about attempting to measure the environmental impact of human activity, especially economic activity, the pollution levels and how certain economic activities affect plant, animal life, air quality. Again, you'd have a group of governments or individuals or clubs members around the world who are all interested in this specific data set. Likewise, you might have the healthcare industry who shares patients' records on individuals who all have similar types of cancer. So this is a unique approach, but technology alone will not be enough to create these clubs. Right? They need institutions that provide data stewardship, right? Data cooperatives, personal data stores. If we do not have these institutions in place, it stands to reason that the idea of everyone sharing with equal access through the club may break down. Some individuals may have incentive to prevent other institutions from acquiring the data. Other institutions may not want to share data. It's only if we establish data stewardship that data as a club good makes sense as an interpretation. The question of regulation. What to do with these giant firms, especially the tech firms. So the next section of the presentation focuses on a question presented in an article by The Economist. Are anti-competitive firms killing American innovation? So, the article describes the consumer paradise created by technological innovation, which was introduced into the U.S. economy in the late 80s and early 90s. During this period, in the late 80s and early 90s, consumers had access to extremely low cost of goods and services, such as internet services, electronic devices, airline services, and other goods and services. The past 2 decades have seen an erosion of what Adam Smith referred to as consumer sovereignty, the idea that consumers vote with their dollars and lead the direction of production, allocating resources towards producing goods and services most desired by consumers. Over the past 2 decades, GDP growth has slowed, real wages have been stagnant, that is to say, wages adjusted for inflation, and even more worrisome, productivity has slowed. Over this 20-year period, inequality has risen. The difference between the amount of income received by the highest income earners versus the lowest income earners, and really everyone in between. So there may be a correlation between significant rise in the market share and profitability of the most dominant firms and the increase in income inequality. Here are the facts. Between 1987 and 2016, the share of employment accounted for by big firms, those firms with 5,000 employees or more, rose from 28% to 34%. So that's a 6% increase in the share of employees accounted for by the big firms. Between 1997 and 2012, the average share of revenues accounted for by the top 4 firms in each of the 900 economic sectors grew from 26% to 32%. So the big question is, what is causing this concentration of economic power? If you look at the second bullet point here, it's a debate between these 2 competing theories. First theory is the idea of lax antitrust, antitrust being too lackadaisical, anti-competitive practices, and friendly regulatory changes, which favored large firms, versus the second theory. The second theory is highly innovative and productive companies pushing aside unfit competitors. The first explanation makes the argument lax antitrust enforcement, anti-competitive practices, and regulatory changes friendly to powerful firms provides the answer to the question of what is going on with the concentration of economic power. A competing theory suggests the success of superstar firms, these giant mega firms, especially in the tech industry. All right. This second argument explains the increase in concentration of power at the top industries by proposing that highly innovative and productive companies pushed aside unfit competitors, which sounds like good old market economics. Now, attempting to determine which theory is correct has serious implications on not only future economic growth, but on future policy. Third bullet point here, the Tobin Q, right? Tobin's Q. So there's an economic tool known as Tobin's Q. It may help settle the argument. What is Tobin's Q? All right, it's important to understand this before we go any further. It's a measure of a firm's market value relative to the cost of replacing its assets. Let me say that again. Tobin's Q is a measure of the firm's market value relative to the cost of replacing its assets, machines, equipment, tools, factory, and such. Named for its inventor, James Tobin. A high Tobin Q indicates that future profits are likely to be high relative to the cost of expanding production. There's been a high Tobin's Q lately or over this period. All right, the idea is go big or go home. Evidence suggests leading firms should scale up. Otherwise, they might see a flood of investment by competitors seeking to divert part of their profit stream. Right? So, in theory, when we observe a high Tobin's Q, profitable firms should ramp up investment and therefore fend off new entrants from participating in the market, competition eroding some of their profitability. However, investment has lagged behind the expected rate given the high level of Tobin's Q across the economy. Further, the most concentrated sectors account for nearly all of the investment shortfall. That's definitely worrisome. All right, here's where the debate about data is reintroduced to the conversation. There's been a shift in investment from tangible capital, such as machines and equipment, to intangible capital, such as intellectual property and data. This may somehow explain what is going on in the concentration of power, especially in tech industries. We continue this discussion about regulation by identifying a few issues unique to tech. First, economics is a social science, and understanding concentration in big tech provides unique issues because big tech is a relatively new phenomena. Anytime there's a new aspect to the economy, it's challenging for would-be regulators to make correct decisions because there's no former cases or evidence that it can be used as a paradigm. Now, let's compare big tech to other industries. The lack of competition in healthcare, finance, and telecoms, air travel, it's readily identifiable, and the problems with competition in these sectors, it's accepted by all Americans and economists. So no one ever debates whether there's a bit of too much concentration of power in those industries. How to regulate them, usually not all that difficult an issue to identify either. Unfortunately, this isn't the same with big tech. All right? The issues with competition in big tech, they're far more clouded. All right? It is a difficult issue because tech giants have not used their market share or their market power to raise prices. It's kind of crazy, but on the contrary, much of what they provide to consumers is actually free. The firms at the top invest heavily and eke out only small profit margins. But if we look at this idea of complex issues, economic power is not all that matters. Tech giants could be thwarting new competition, could be keeping out competitors because they buy smaller companies before they become competition. Further, these tech companies spend lavishly on political donations and lobbying. All right? So the question is, after they've achieved this market dominance, all right, will there be less incentive for them to invest and innovate and more incentive for them to continue worrying about their political donations and campaigns and their lobbying? All right? So they may engage in anti-competitive behavior. Even if these giant firms are economically efficient, their influence over communities and social norms and politics is sometimes worrisome and disconcerting. So the question of whether or not to regulate is a difficult one to answer. These big tech firms could continue to offer low cost or free services and drive productivity. They also could continue to offer a social benefit. Some people look at Twitter and Facebook, Instagram, and other social medias, and they try to identify the social benefits associated with these social media apps and social media platforms. To regulate or not to regulate, that is the question. Maybe we can use some graphs over the next few slides to help us make sense of this question. Remember, the principal purpose of this presentation was to compare and contrast the economic efficiency which takes place in a purely competitive market industry versus an industry dominated by one firm, pure monopoly. We introduced the idea of economic efficiency earlier in the video, but we will revisit and explain economic efficiency in a purely competitive market situation to compare and contrast what happens when there is one firm dominating the industry in a pure monopoly. On the left-hand side, we have a graph which represents a purely competitive market. Let's revisit why economists believe a purely competitive market leads to an efficient outcome. Some basic review. Downward sloping demand curve, literally millions of buyers. All right, so that's your market demand. All right, demand is the various amounts of a good or service that buyers are willing to purchase, series of prices, specified amount of time. All right, buyers are acting in their own rational self-interest to maximize utility. Supply curve, upward sloping red supply curve. Upward sloping red supply curve. Let's assume this is the market for oil produced by directional drilling and fracking. Let's assume there's 1,000 firms in the industry. So that upward sloping market supply curve represents the 1,000 producers, large number of sellers in the market. Notice it says S equals MC. What does that mean? Okay, S is easy. That's the market supply. Why does it say S equals MC? It's a reasonable economic assumption that each of the producers faces a similar cost structure. In other words, they each have access to similar technologies and resources necessary to produce this particular product, in this case, oil, right? Therefore, they each have a similar cost structure. So, what is marginal cost? It's the cost associated with producing the next unit of output. The change in total cost that the firm incurs by producing the next unit of output. So, in essence, the market supply curve is simply the addition of all of the individual firms' marginal cost curves. Now that we've identified this principle, we notice PC and QC. Purely competitive equilibrium. Price at C, quantity at C. This leads to the most efficient outcome. Why? Because price equals marginal cost, which means this industry will achieve allocative efficiency. That is to say, resources will be used up to and including the point where the marginal benefit of consuming and producing the next unit equals the marginal cost. Likewise, this industry will achieve productive efficiency. Price equals minimum average total cost. How is this possible? Because each firm is forced to adopt the least cost method of production because they are price takers. Therefore, they will constantly seek out the most efficient means to produce goods or services. Price equals marginal cost, allocative efficiency. Price equals minimum average total cost, productive efficiency. Let's compare and contrast this to the situation in a monopoly. Notice, monopoly is a price maker. Monopoly is a price maker. Right away, you notice that the monopoly price is higher than the purely competitive price. How does the monopolist achieve this higher price? Because there's only one producer, and the one producer can restrict outputs because they control the entire industry. Notice that quantity, QM, monopoly quantity of output, is far less than QC. So the monopolist doesn't have to settle for PC, the purely competitive market price. The monopolist can charge PM, a higher price. In economic terms, we sometimes call this unfair rent. The monopolist achieves this higher price by restricting output somewhat and charging a price that is otherwise higher than what would take place in a competitive industry. Now, why is this inefficient? Notice that triangle. We'll call it the ABC triangle. And we'll call that color light tan, ABC triangle. Economists call this dead weight loss. What's happening is this. In terms of allocative efficiency, this market is not allocating enough resources towards the production of this particular good. Why? Because society would want QC level of output, so there would be more resources needed, more land capital and labor needed to produce QC. The industry is only producing QM. So this firm and this industry is failing to achieve efficiency from the standpoint of allocative efficiency. Why? Because not enough of the product is being produced. Likewise, there's no incentive for this firm to seek out the least cost method of production, and price is above a purely competitive market situation. This means we're not achieving productive efficiency. That triangle, ABC, represents efficiency loss to society. Now that we understand the basics of efficiency, which occurs in a purely competitive situation, versus the outcome in an industry dominated by one firm, let's talk about why this occurs and possible solutions to the issue. What are we looking at on this graph? This is the long-run average total cost curve in an industry dominated by one firm. So, in theory, a large firm should be achieving what economists refer to as economies of scale. That is to say, they've made significant capital expenditures in machinery and plants and technology to produce at an average total cost well below what would be achievable if a few smaller firms attempted to produce this same product. So in large-scale manufacturing, such as automobile manufacturing, economies of scale is present. So if you compare Q2 level of output, average total cost per unit at ATC2, with Q1 level of output, average total cost of ATC1, notice that there are economic advantages of growing large. Theoretically, these large firms should make significant investment in efficient capital, which allows them to achieve economies of scale. However, earlier in this presentation, we visited a measure of the amount of investment in capital made by large firms as measured by Tobin's Q. And the recent evidence suggests that large firms are not heavily investing in capital. That leads to what economists refer to as X inefficiencies. Notice, the firm should achieve an average total cost per unit at ATC2. But perhaps they're not making necessary investments in new technologies and capital infrastructure to achieve this low average total cost per unit. Instead, they're producing and achieving only ATC X prime. So if you see the X prime labeled above Q2, that means that each unit is being produced at a higher average total cost than should be the case. Now, why aren't new firms entering the industry to take advantage of this inefficiency? We also discussed this, now that we can understand it graphically. Some of these large companies, especially the big tech companies, are guilty of rent-seeking expenditures. That is to say, they're spending money on influencing lobbyists and political campaigns to install people into office that are sympathetic to the corporation's long-term profitability. Obviously, that's not good for society. That leads to X inefficiency. The other issue is about technological advancement. Remember, one of the issues with these big tech companies is that they continue to buy up would-be competitors. These tech companies have significant hordes of cash on their balance sheet and are able to purchase little companies when they come to market. For instance, Facebook purchased Instagram. Google purchased YouTube. These two firms could have represented new competitors to each of the aforementioned big tech monopolies. Buying up your would-be competitor means that you are in some way thwarting technological advancement because new companies don't have the life expectancy to become more efficient. On the remaining graph, we will look at assessment and policy options to address this situation. The final piece of our presentation is what's called the dilemma of regulation. So, we've already identified the idea that in a monopoly, the one firm which dominates the industry can charge a price higher than what is available in a competitive market. In an industry where there are thousands of firms and each firm shares the market almost equally, the price would be much lower and quantity of production would be higher. So the firm in a monopoly is a price maker, sets price and makes economic profit. Perhaps the government should step in and regulate the industry. If the government regulates the industry, they would force the monopolist, the single seller in producing a product for which there's significant demand and no close substitutes, to charge a price lower than a non-regulated or an unregulated monopoly situation. We call this the socially optimal price. Notice that in this situation, price equals marginal cost, right? Notice how far price drops from PM level to PR, socially optimal price. Notice the significant increase in quantity of output from QM to QR. Here's the issue. If we look at the firm's average total cost structure, the socially optimal price may actually force a monopolist to suffer losses. Notice how price, PR, is below the red average total cost curve at QR level of output. At the socially optimal price, the monopolist would eventually go out of business after suffering a series of short-run losses. Now, no one wants that to happen because they're producing a product for which there's significant demand. Therefore, regulators should attempt to charge what's known as the fair return price. Notice, in the fair return price situation, P subset F, at level of output QF, price equals average total cost, and the single seller is just making enough profit to cover all of its costs, no longer making economic profits. Here's the real issue. This all sounds well and good because on a graph, you can label all of the prices: monopoly price, socially optimal price, fair return price. In reality, it's not this simple. This becomes even more difficult in the tech industry. Why? Have you ever paid for a Google search? No. Have you ever paid to use Facebook? You have not. Is Instagram free? Yes. I know you have to watch commercials on YouTube, but there's a lot of free content on YouTube. This model was designed at a time when the large firms achieved monopoly power through ownership of resources or through patents or through some other economic advantage which created barriers to entry. Today, regulation is not so simple. If we attempt to regulate these large tech firms, we actually might introduce additional inefficiencies into the markets. In other words, it's a balancing act. You weigh the social benefit associated with literally millions of individuals using these services for free versus the control of industry and the economy that's been dominated by the large firms and their potential influence over the political process. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you've learned much on the competitive nature of big tech industries.